The sound of metal slamming against metal echoed through the security checkpoint like a gunshot. "Take off the jacket, now!" Sergeant First Class Silas Briggs stood with his arms crossed over his chest, looking down at the woman before him, as if she were garbage that had somehow drifted into the largest naval base on the east coast of the United States. The woman stood motionless. Her hair was a tangled mess, unwashed and hanging limply around a face that showed no expression. She wore a faded denim jacket, worn through at the elbows, and jeans with holes at the knees that spoke of poverty rather than fashion. No purse, no wallet, no identification of any kind, and not a single word of explanation. "I said take it off." Briggs stepped forward, his voice carrying across the entire security area with the authority of a man who had never once questioned his own power. "Or I'll have someone do it for you." 23 pairs of eyes turned toward them. Soldiers stopped mid-stride. Civilian contractors looked up from their paperwork. An elderly veteran in a wheelchair leaned forward, his weathered eyes narrowing as he watched the scene unfold. The woman slowly removed her jacket. Underneath was a gray t-shirt, old and oversized, hanging loosely on a frame that seemed almost fragile. She couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds. Her arms were thin, her shoulders slumped. Everything about her screamed vulnerability. Specialist Amber Lawson let out a sharp laugh from behind the inspection counter. Probably homeless looking for a place to sleep. Norfolk's full of them. She pulled out her personal phone and snapped a photo, already composing the caption in her head. Briggs snatched the jacket from the woman's hands and began rifling through the pockets with deliberate roughness. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He threw the jacket onto the concrete floor. "Name." Silence. "I asked you what your name is." The woman raised her head, and for the first time she looked directly into Briggs's eyes. That gaze didn't belong to a homeless person. It didn't belong to a victim. It was the gaze of someone who was evaluating, measuring, recording every single detail with the precision of a machine. But Briggs didn't notice. In the next 20 minutes, everything he thought he knew was about to collapse completely. The fluorescent lights of the checkpoint hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the polished floor. Norfolk Naval Station sprawled beyond the security barriers, home to the largest concentration of naval power in the Western Hemisphere. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, the beating heart of American naval supremacy. And standing at its gates was a woman who looked like she'd wandered in from a bus stop. Briggs circled her slowly, the way a predator circles wounded prey. He was a big man, 6'3", with shoulders that strained against his uniform, and he had spent 12 years in security positions that had taught him one thing above all else. Civilians were sheep, and sheep needed to be shown who held the crook. "You understand you're trespassing on federal property?" His voice dripped with condescension. "That's a felony. 5 years minimum. Maybe more if we find out you're working for someone." The woman said nothing. "Maybe she doesn't speak English," Connor Reed suggested. He was young, barely 21, with the kind of face that still held baby fat. Private first class, fresh out of training, and eager to prove himself to the senior guards. He walked past the woman and let his boot catch her ankle, stumbling dramatically. "Oops, sorry about that." The woman didn't fall, didn't even sway. Her legs held firm as if they were rooted to the concrete itself, absorbing the impact with a stability that seemed almost mechanical. Connor's eyebrows rose slightly, but he shook it off and rejoined Amber at the counter. "Check the database again," Briggs ordered. "Female, approximately 45 to 50 years old, 5'6", no distinguishing marks visible, no identification, cross-reference with missing persons." Petty Officer Second Class Flynn Garrett nodded and turned to his computer, fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. He was the technical specialist of the group, methodical and precise, and unlike his colleagues, he found no pleasure in the spectacle unfolding before him. Something about the woman's stillness bothered him. It was too complete, too controlled. The woman's eyes moved almost imperceptibly, tracking across the checkpoint in a pattern that Flynn couldn't quite identify. She looked at the camera mounted in the far corner, then at the one above the door, then at the gap between them. Her gaze lingered on the motion sensor beside the main entrance, then shifted to the ventilation grate near the ceiling. 3 seconds, maybe 4, and something in her expression shifted, so subtle that if you blinked, you'd miss it entirely. The elderly veteran in the wheelchair noticed. His name was Hector Morrison, 78 years old, a Vietnam War survivor who had seen more combat than everyone in this checkpoint combined. He'd come to visit an old friend in the hospital wing, but now he sat frozen, watching the woman with an intensity that bordered on recognition. "Bring her to the inspection room," Briggs commanded. "Full search." 2 guards moved forward, but the woman spoke before they could touch her. "Inspection room, not here." Her voice was level, flat, completely devoid of emotion, but there was something beneath it, something that made Connor actually step backward without realizing he had moved. Briggs laughed. It was a cruel sound, designed to humiliate. "You think you get to make demands? Lady, you're about 3 seconds away from spending the night in a holding cell. Move." What Sergeant Briggs doesn't realize is that every word he's saying, every action he's taking, is being recorded. Not by cameras, by something far more dangerous. If you think you know where this story is heading, I promise you, you don't. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will completely change how you see this woman. And trust me, you don't want to miss the moment everything falls apart. The inspection room was small, barely 10 feet by 12, with concrete walls painted government gray and a single table bolted to the floor. A 2-way mirror dominated one wall, though no one was watching from the other side. The camera in the corner had a red light that should have been blinking, but wasn't. The woman noticed immediately. She stepped into the room and positioned herself in the far corner, her back to the wall, with a clear sight line to the door. It was the kind of positioning that Briggs had seen in training manuals, the kind that combat veterans did instinctively after years of having to watch their backs. But this woman was homeless, probably mentally ill, definitely not a threat. "Arms out," Amber commanded, pulling on a pair of latex gloves with an exaggerated snap. She'd followed them into the room, eager to be part of whatever was about to happen. "We're going to conduct a thorough search, for your safety and ours." The woman extended her arms. Amber started with the pockets of the jeans, finding nothing but lint. Then she moved to the waistband, the socks, the collar of the t-shirt. Her hands were rough, deliberately so, treating the woman's body like an object to be processed, rather than a person to be respected. "What's this?" Amber's fingers closed around something beneath the gray fabric, a chain hidden under the shirt. She yanked it free, pulling out a thin silver necklace with a small metal pendant. The pendant was unusual, not quite round, not quite square. The surface had been worn smooth by years of handling, but faint markings were still visible if you looked closely, symbols that meant nothing to Amber's untrained eyes. "What is this? Some kind of good luck charm?" She held it up to the light, examining it with mock curiosity. "Looks like something you'd find in a cereal box." The woman's eyes followed the pendant, but her expression remained unchanged. "It's a challenge coin," a voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. Master Chief Caleb Porter stood at the threshold, his weathered face unreadable. He was in his late 50s, with gray hair cropped close to his skull, and the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of service. He'd been walking past when something had made him stop, something he couldn't quite name. "Let me see that," he said, stepping into the room without asking permission. Amber hesitated, then handed it over. Porter turned the coin in his fingers, his brow furrowing as he studied the worn surface. The symbols were almost completely erased, but he could make out fragments. An eagle, a trident, numbers that might have been a date or might have been something else entirely. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition? Concern? It was gone before anyone could identify it. "Where did you get this?" he asked the woman, his voice softer than it had any right to be. She didn't answer. "Master Chief, this is a security matter," Briggs interrupted, his tone making it clear that Porter's presence was unwelcome. "We'll handle it from here." Porter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked at the woman one more time, something unspoken passing between them, and then he stepped back. "Of course, Sergeant. Just making sure protocol is being followed." He placed the coin on the table and left, but not before glancing back over his shoulder. The woman watched him go. Master Chief Porter pulled out his tablet, one of those ruggedized military-grade devices built to survive sandstorms, drops, and combat zones. The kind with encrypted storage that could hold classified documents without leaving a digital footprint. He tapped the screen twice, his weathered fingers moving with practiced efficiency, and started pulling up the base security protocols. What he found would change everything. Back in the inspection room, the atmosphere had grown heavier. Briggs stood with his arms crossed, watching as Amber continued her search. The woman had been subjected to a pat-down that bordered on assault, her clothing examined inch by inch, and yet she hadn't complained, hadn't protested, hadn't done anything except stand there with that same unnerving stillness. "Nothing on her," Amber reported, frustration creeping into her voice. "No weapons, no drugs, no ID, just that stupid coin." "What about the metal detector hit?" Briggs asked. "It registered something on her left side. Must have been the chain. It's the only metal she's got." Briggs wasn't satisfied. He stepped closer to the woman, invading her personal space with deliberate aggression. "Who are you? And don't give me the silent treatment. I've been doing this for 12 years. I can make your life very, very difficult." The woman tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Then she spoke, her voice still flat, but with something new underneath it, something that sounded almost like amusement. "You should check your camera." Briggs blinked. "What?" "Upper left corner. The red light isn't blinking, which means it's either been disabled or it's recording to an external source. Your motion sensor by the door has a 3-second delay between activation and alert, plenty of time for someone to slip through. And the ventilation grate above us, no security screen. A child could fit through it." The room went silent. Flynn, who had followed them in with his laptop, immediately pulled up the security diagnostics. His face went pale. "She's right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The camera's been offline for 6 hours. The motion sensor is showing a delay of exactly 3.2 seconds. And the ventilation," he scrolled through the building schematics. "There's no security grating installed. It's on the maintenance request list from 8 months ago." Amber's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Connor looked like he might be sick. And Briggs stood frozen, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been the first stirring of fear. "How do you know this?" he demanded. "How the hell do you know this?" The woman didn't answer. She simply looked at the clock on the wall. It was 14:32 hours. She'd been in the checkpoint for exactly 17 minutes. The door opened, and Lieutenant Commander Fiona Drake stepped into the already crowded room. She was tall, angular, with sharp features and the kind of expression that suggested she had neither the time nor the patience for whatever was happening here. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes scanning the scene. "I've got a briefing in 20 minutes, and I'm hearing reports of some kind of incident." "Unidentified female, ma'am," Briggs reported, snapping to attention. "No ID, no explanation, refused to answer questions. We're conducting a thorough search." Drake looked at the woman, taking in the disheveled appearance, the worn clothes, the apparent poverty. Her lip curled slightly. "This is what's causing all the commotion? Some homeless vagrant?" She checked her watch. "Process her and move on, Sergeant. We don't have all day." "Yes, ma'am. We're just—" "I said process her." Drake's voice left no room for argument. "Follow the protocol, document and mint everything, and either release her or hand her over to the MPs. I don't care which. Just get it done." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "And Sergeant, make sure this doesn't happen again. Security should be able to handle a single unarmed woman without turning it into a circus." She was gone before Briggs could respond. The woman watched Drake's departure with those same measuring eyes. When the lieutenant commander passed directly in front of her, she didn't look away. She didn't shrink back. And for just a moment, so brief that no one else noticed, Drake hesitated. Her stride faltered by half a step, as if some primitive part of her brain had registered a threat that her conscious mind couldn't identify. Then she was out the door, heels clicking against the concrete floor. Outside the inspection room, a small crowd had gathered. Word had spread through the checkpoint like wildfire, and now soldiers and civilians alike were finding excuses to linger near the windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was happening inside. Among them was Willow Chen, 19 years old, 3 weeks out of boot camp, and so green that she still flinched when senior officers walked past. She'd been on her way to report for duty when the commotion had caught her attention, and now she stood near the back of the crowd, watching with wide eyes. "Who is she?" she asked the soldier next to her, a specialist named Marcus who'd been stationed at Norfolk for 3 years. Marcus shrugged. "Nobody knows, no story, just walked up to the gate and stood there. Briggs is losing his mind." "Should we do something?" Marcus laughed. "Like what? Go in there and ask her nicely? Trust me, Chen. Whatever's happening in there, you want no part of it. Just watch and learn. This is how things work in the real Navy." Inside the room, the real Navy was demonstrating exactly how things worked. Briggs had recovered from his momentary confusion and was now channeling it into anger. I don't know how you know about our security systems, he said, stepping even closer to the woman, but that just tells me you're not some random homeless person. You've been casing this place, probably planning something. Sergeant, Flynn began. Shut up, Garrett. I'm handling this. Briggs pulled out his radio. This is Checkpoint Alpha. I need military police to the main inspection room. We have a potential security threat. The woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the room. The air seemed to grow heavier. Amber took an unconscious step backward, positioning herself closer to the door. You know what I think? Briggs continued, his voice low and dangerous. I think you're some kind of spy, maybe Russian, maybe Chinese. It would explain why you know so much about our systems. It would explain why you won't talk. He smiled, the expression ugly with satisfaction. The MPs will get the truth out of you. They have ways. The door opened again, and the wheelchair rolled in. Hector Morrison Churron, the Vietnam veteran, had maneuvered his chair down the hallway and through the gathering crowd, and now he sat in the doorway with an expression that made him look decades younger. Son, he said, his voice carrying the gravel of 78 years of hard living, I think you're making a very big mistake. Briggs spun around. Sir, this is a restricted area. You need to leave immediately. I served 32 years in this country's military, Hector said, his eyes never leaving the woman. Started as a private, ended as a colonel. I've seen a lot of things in those years. Things that would give you nightmares for the rest of your life. He paused, his gaze sharpening. And I've learned to recognize certain qualities that most people miss. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to... That woman, Hector continued, pointing at her with a gnarled finger, isn't what you think she is, not by a long shot. Briggs's face reddened with anger. With all due respect, sir, this is none of your concern. Now, please leave before I have you removed. For a long moment, Hector didn't move. He just sat there, looking at the woman with something that might have been respect, might have been recognition. Then he shook his head slowly. When you realize what you've done, he said quietly, remember that I tried to warn you. He turned his wheelchair and rolled away, leaving a silence that seemed to echo with unspoken meaning. Did you catch that? The way she moved? Something is very wrong here, or very right, depending on whose side you're on. Drop a comment below with your theory about who she really is. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the truth is about to start leaking through the cracks. The military police arrived at 14:47 hours. Sergeant Major Theo Grant and Corporal Isaac Webb, two men who looked like they'd been carved from the same block of granite. Grant was the senior officer, mid-50s with salt and pepper hair and a face that had seen too many court-martials to count. Webb was younger, quieter, with the watchful eyes of someone who'd learned that silence was often more useful than speech. Sergeant Briggs, Grant said, surveying the scene with professional detachment. Report. Unidentified female, Sergeant Major. No ID, no cooperation, possible security threat. She demonstrated detailed knowledge of our security systems. Camera placements, sensor delays, structural vulnerabilities. I believe she may have been conducting reconnaissance for a hostile party. Grant's eyes moved to the woman. She hadn't shifted position since entering the room, still standing in that corner, with her back to the wall, still watching everything with those dark, measuring eyes. Ma'am, Grant said, and the word came out differently than it had from Briggs, softer, almost respectful. Do you understand why you're being detained? The woman met his gaze. Something passed between them, a flicker of something that Webb caught, but Briggs missed entirely. Grant's posture changed, almost imperceptibly. His shoulders drew back, his chin lifted. Ma'am, he said again, is there anything you'd like to say before we proceed? The woman spoke. 3 words. Call Commander Hayes. The name landed like a bomb in the small room. Commander Solomon Hayes was the commanding officer of Naval Station Norfolk, the man who oversaw everything that happened within these gates. The man whose schedule was managed by 3 assistants and whose time was worth more than any of them would ever make in a lifetime. Amber laughed nervously. You can't just ask for the commander. Do you know who he is? I know exactly who he is, the woman said. It was the longest sentence she'd spoken since arriving. Drake, who had returned after receiving the MP notification, shook her head with barely concealed contempt. This is ridiculous. She's clearly delusional. Process her and be done with it. Ma'am, Grant said slowly, his eyes still fixed on the woman, you're asking me to contact the commanding officer of this base. That's not something I can do without justification. The woman didn't blink. You'll find the justification. I suggest you make the call. That's enough. Briggs stepped forward, handcuffs in his hand. Sergeant Major, with your permission, I'd like to restrain the suspect and... He reached for her wrist. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. The woman's body rotated, a controlled pivot that used Briggs's own momentum against him. Her arm moved in a precise arc, breaking his grip with a technique that Flynn would later identify from his martial arts training as a textbook joint manipulation. Briggs stumbled backward, off balance, and his hand shot out instinctively, grabbing at the only thing within reach. The woman's shirt, the fabric, already old and worn, tore from the shoulder down to the middle of her chest, and the room went completely still. The tear exposed her left shoulder and part of her upper chest. The skin there was pale, marked with old scars that told stories of violence survived. But it wasn't the scars that made everyone freeze. It was the tattoo. Above her heart, inked in black that had faded slightly with age but remained unmistakably clear, was an eagle clutching a trident in one talon and a pistol in the other. Below the eagle, an anchor, and beneath that, small but perfectly legible, the words that made Sergeant Major Grant's knees actually buckle. DEVGRU, 7 Naval Special Warfare Development Group. SEAL Team 7. The most elite special operations unit in the United States military. A unit so classified that its very existence was officially denied for decades. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Amber's phone slipped from her fingers and clattered against the floor. Connor Reed made a sound like a wounded animal. Flynn Garrett stared at his computer screen, where a classified search was returning results that made his blood run cold. And Master Chief Caleb Porter, who had been watching through the two-way mirror from the observation room next door, slowly raised his hand to his forehead. He saluted. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Heavy, purposeful, the kind of footsteps that made junior officers straighten their spines instinctively. Commander Solomon Hayes appeared in the doorway. He was a big man, imposing, with 35 years of service written in the lines of his face. He'd commanded destroyers, led task forces, survived 3 combat deployments. There were very few things in this world that could surprise him, but the woman in the torn shirt surprised him. His face cycled through emotions in rapid succession. Annoyance at being called away from his duties, confusion at the scene before him, recognition as his eyes found the tattoo, and then something that looked very much like terror. He snapped to attention. His hand came up in a salute so crisp that it seemed to slice the air. "Admiral Callahan, ma'am, I wasn't informed of your inspection." The woman, Admiral Ivory Callahan, Rear Admiral Lower Half, Deputy Commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, looked at him with those same measuring eyes. "That," she said quietly, "was the point, Commander." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Briggs had gone gray, his face the color of old newspaper. Amber was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as the reality of what she'd done began to sink in. Connor had actually sat down on the floor, his legs apparently no longer capable of supporting his weight. "You," Drake's voice came out as a croak. "You're an admiral?" "Rear Admiral," Callahan corrected, her voice still perfectly level. "Deputy Commander of NSWC, operating under Ghost Protocol authorization from the Secretary of the Navy." She paused, letting the words sink in. "This was a black assessment of your security procedures, a test to see how your personnel would react to an unknown individual attempting to enter the base." "And?" Hayes asked, though from his expression he already knew the answer. Callahan looked around the room slowly. At Briggs, who couldn't meet her eyes. At Amber, who was sobbing now. At Connor, still on the floor. At Flynn, who stood at attention with the rigid posture of a man facing a firing squad. At Drake, whose face had gone from contempt to horror. "Failure," she said. "Complete and systematic failure." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. "Admiral," Hayes began, "I want to assure you that this behavior does not represent—" "Save it, Commander." Callahan's voice cut through his words like a blade. "I was detained for 32 minutes. In that time, I was verbally abused, physically manhandled, threatened with imprisonment, and ordered to submit to a strip search in a public area." She held up the torn remnants of her shirt. "My clothing was damaged, my dignity was assaulted, and not once did anyone think to verify my identity through proper channels." She walked to the table where her challenge coin still lay, picking it up and turning it in her fingers. "Do you know what this is, Sergeant Briggs?" Briggs opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "It's a SEAL Team 7 coin, given to me by my teammates after our first successful operation in Kandahar, October 2001. I've carried it for 23 years." She looked at Amber. "You called it something from a cereal box." Amber made a choking sound. "Commander Hayes," Callahan continued, "I want a full report on my desk by 1700 hours tomorrow. Personnel files for everyone involved in this incident, training records, performance evaluations, everything." "Yes, Admiral." "And Commander," she turned to face him directly, "call your JAG office. Several of your people are going to need lawyers." The silence that followed was absolute. Outside the inspection room, the crowd that had gathered had grown completely still, words spreading through the checkpoint like ripples in a pond. Phones appeared in hands, but no one dared to record. This was something that would be whispered about, not filmed. Willow Chen stood at the edge of the crowd, her hand frozen halfway to her pocket where her own phone rested. She'd been about to take a video. Something had stopped her. Now, watching through the window as the Admiral stood amid the wreckage of careers she'd just destroyed, Willow understood why her drill instructor had spent so many hours hammering one lesson into their heads. Never assume, never underestimate, and never ever forget that the most dangerous people in the world are often the ones who look the least threatening. Hector Morrison rolled his wheelchair back toward the scene, stopping beside Willow. "You didn't record," he observed. "No, sir. Why not?" Willow thought about it for a moment. "It didn't feel right. This is above my pay grade." The old veteran smiled, revealing teeth yellowed by age but still sharp. "Smart girl. Most people your age would have had that video on the internet before the Admiral finished speaking." He nodded toward the inspection room. "You know what you just witnessed?" "I'm not sure, sir." "Consequences," Hector said. "Real consequences. Something a lot of people forget exist in this world." He began rolling away, then paused. "I served under Admiral Elmo Zumwalt back in Vietnam, one of the greatest naval leaders in history. You know what made him great?" Willow shook her head. "He never forgot that every person in a uniform was a human being first. He judged people by their actions, not their appearance." Hector gestured toward Admiral Callahan. "She reminds me of him, remember that." He rolled away, leaving Willow alone with her thoughts. Inside the inspection room, the initial shock was beginning to give way to the cold, hard reality of what came next. Commander Hayes had dismissed all non-essential personnel, leaving only himself, Admiral Callahan, the 5 primary individuals involved in the incident, and Sergeant Major Grant, who had been identified as the only person to treat the Admiral with appropriate respect before her identity was revealed. "Admiral," Hayes said carefully, "may I ask how you would like to proceed?" Callahan had retrieved her denim jacket from where Briggs had thrown it on the floor. She put it on over her torn shirt, covering the tattoos that had changed everything. "First," she said, "I want to review the security footage from this incident. All of it, of course. Second, I want to see the inspection records for this checkpoint going back 6 months. Include training logs, certification dates, and any previous incidents involving civilian detainees. I'll have it compiled within the hour. Third," she turned to face the 5 people whose lives she now held in her hands. "I wanted to speak with each of them individually, starting with Sergeant Briggs." Lieutenant Commander Drake thought about her career, 15 years of service, her military retirement fund, the veteran life insurance policy she'd just upgraded last month. Everything she'd worked for could vanish in a single moment of bad judgment. The specialized coverage for military families wasn't cheap, but looking at the woman in front of her now, Drake realized some decisions cost far more than money. The individual interviews took place in Hayes' office, 1 floor up from the checkpoint. It was a corner room with windows overlooking the base, walls covered with commendations and photographs of ships that Hayes had commanded. An American flag stood in one corner. A Naval Academy pennant hung behind the desk. Briggs went first. He entered the office like a man walking to his own execution, which wasn't far from the truth. Callahan sat behind Hayes' desk. The commander had insisted, a gesture of deference that spoke volumes about the power dynamics at play. She didn't look up when Briggs entered. She was reading something on a tablet, her finger swiping slowly across the screen. "Sit down, Sergeant." Briggs sat. His hands were shaking. 12 years in security positions, Callahan said, still reading. Promoted twice. Reprimanded once, in 2018, for excessive force during a detention. She looked up. That reprimand was removed from your record after you filed a grievance. Do you remember what you said in that grievance? Briggs's throat worked. I said that the force was justified given the threat level. The detainee was a 17-year-old dependent who'd forgotten her ID card. Callahan's voice was ice. She weighed 90 pounds. She was crying, and you threw her against a wall hard enough to leave bruises. The report? I've read the report. I've also read the original incident statement before it was modified by your supervisor. She set the tablet down. I'm going to ask you a question, Sergeant, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Why did you treat me the way you did? Briggs opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The protocol doesn't state that you should throw a detainee's personal belongings on the floor. Protocol doesn't state that you should mock them, threaten them, or order a strip search in a public area. Protocol states that you should identify, document, verify, and escalate. Callahan leaned forward. You did none of those things, so I'll ask again, why? The silence stretched. When Briggs finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Because I could. Callahan nodded slowly. Because you could. Because you had power. And I had none. Because there were no consequences, no oversight, no one who would believe my word against yours. She stood. That, Sergeant, is the definition of abuse of authority. And in the United States Navy, abuse of authority is not just a violation of regulations. It's a betrayal of everything this uniform is supposed to represent. Admiral, please, court-martial, Callahan said flatly. You'll be formally charged within 72 hours. Until then, you're relieved of duty and confined to quarters. She picked up the phone on the desk. Sergeant Major Grant, please escort Sergeant Briggs to his quarters. As Briggs was led away, something broke inside him. Not his pride. That had been shattered the moment he had seen that tattoo. Something deeper. Something that had allowed him to believe for 12 years that he was one of the good guys. He wasn't crying. Men like Briggs didn't cry. But the hollowness in his eyes told the same story. Amber was next. Unlike Briggs, she didn't try to explain or justify. She walked in, sat down, and waited for judgment with the resigned expression of someone who knew there was no escape. Specialist Lawson, Callahan began. Tell me about the photographs. Amber's face, already pale, went gray. The photographs? The ones you took on your personal phone, of me, in a detention situation. Callahan's voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. Did you think I didn't notice? I was going to delete them. Were you? Before or after you posted them on social media? Amber said nothing. I've already requested a warrant for your phone records. I suspect we'll find that you've done this before. Other detainees, other vulnerable people who had the misfortune of passing through your checkpoint. Callahan folded her hands on the desk. Tell me I'm wrong? Amber's silence was answer enough. Discharge, Callahan said. Other than honorable conditions. You'll lose your benefits, your security clearance, and any hope of government employment for the next 10 years. If the phone records show what I think they'll show, you may also face criminal charges for privacy violations. I have a child, Amber whispered. A mortgage. Please. You should have thought about that before you treated vulnerable people like entertainment. Callahan's voice held no sympathy. Dismissed. Connor Reed came next, and his interview was the shortest. He walked in crying, sat down crying, and spent the first 5 minutes apologizing through sobs that made his words nearly incomprehensible. He was 21 years old. He'd joined the Navy because his father had served, and his grandfather before that. He'd never expected to end up here. You kicked me, Callahan said when he'd calmed enough to speak, when you walked past. You deliberately struck me and then pretended to trip. I was trying to fit in, Connor managed. Briggs and Amber, They said I needed to show I wasn't soft, that I needed to prove myself. And proving yourself meant assaulting a detainee? I didn't think of it as assault. I thought... He trailed off, unable to finish. Callahan studied him for a long moment. He was young, scared, easily influenced by the wrong people. In another context, he might have become a good sailor, a good man. Private Reed, she said finally, you're going to be investigated. Depending on what that investigation finds, you may face administrative action or criminal charges. In the meantime, You're suspended from security duties. Yes, ma'am. But I'm going to tell you something that I want you to remember for the rest of your career. She leaned forward. Following orders doesn't mean following anyone's orders. It means following lawful orders from authorized personnel. What Briggs was doing wasn't lawful. What Amber was doing wasn't lawful. And when you went along with it, you became complicit in their misconduct. I understand, ma'am. Do you? Because the next time someone tells you to mistreat a detainee, I want you to remember this moment. Remember how it feels to sit across from the person you wronged and have no excuse that matters. Connor nodded, tears still streaming down his face. Dismissed. Flynn Garrett's interview took longer and went in a direction no one expected. He entered the office with his shoulders squared and his spine straight, the posture of a man who knew he was guilty but refused to show fear. Unlike the others, he didn't sit until Callahan gestured to the chair. Petty Officer Garrett, she began, scanning his file on the tablet. Interesting record, cryptologic technician, top scores in your class, certified in network security, digital forensics, and signals intelligence. She looked up. You're overqualified for checkpoint duty. I'm serving where I'm assigned, ma'am. Why? With your qualifications, you could be working at NSA, CIA, any number of three-letter agencies that would kill for your skill set. She set the tablet down. Instead, you're here, running a metal detector and entering data into a database. Flynn said nothing. You were the only one who questioned the search, Callahan continued. When Briggs ordered the strip search, you hesitated. When I described the security vulnerabilities, you verified them immediately, and your reaction told me you didn't know about them before. She tilted her head slightly. Why? Permission to speak freely, ma'am? Granted. Flynn took a breath. I requested checkpoint duty because I wanted to understand how security works at the ground level. Theoretical knowledge isn't enough. You need to see how systems actually function in practice, with human variables involved. He paused. What happened today? I knew it was wrong. I should have done more to stop it. Why didn't you? Because Briggs is my superior. Because Lieutenant Commander Drake authorized the search. Because the chain of command... He stopped, shaking his head. There's no excuse. I should have spoken up. I didn't. Callahan studied him for a long moment. You verified my information about the security vulnerabilities. How quickly? 23 seconds, ma'am. And if that information had been wrong, if I'd been lying to create a distraction, I would have flagged it immediately and alerted the MPs. A ghost of something that might have been approval crossed Callahan's face. Petty Officer Garrett, I'm going to recommend that you be reassigned to a position that better utilizes your capabilities. You'll receive a letter of counseling for your role in today's events, but no formal disciplinary action. Flynn blinked. Ma'am? You made mistakes today, but you also demonstrated critical thinking under pressure, willingness to question assumptions, and, most importantly, the integrity to admit fault without deflection. She stood, signaling the interview was over. The Navy needs more people like that. Don't make me regret this decision. I won't, ma'am. Thank you. As Flynn left, something had shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly, something more like resolve. Fiona Drake was last. She entered Hayes's office with the rigid bearing of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. Her career wasn't just damaged, it was hanging by a thread, and she knew it. 15 years of service, promotions, commendations, all of it potentially erased by one afternoon of bad judgment. Lieutenant Commander Drake, Callahan said, gesturing to the chair. Drake sat. I've reviewed your record. Exemplary service, strong evaluations, leadership potential. Callahan paused. And yet, Drake repeated, her voice hollow. You walked into that checkpoint, saw a woman being mistreated, and your first instinct was to accelerate the process rather than question it. Callahan's voice was cool, analytical. Why? Drake was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I was busy. Because she looked like nothing, like no one important. She swallowed hard. Because I assumed. You assumed. Yes, ma'am. And what have you learned today about assumptions? Drake looked up, meeting Callahan's eyes for the first time. That they can end careers, end lives. That when you're in a position of authority, every assumption you make has consequences for people who can't fight back. Callahan nodded slowly. Lieutenant Commander, I'm not going to end your career today. Drake's breath caught. You're going to receive a letter of reprimand that will go into your permanent file. It will likely affect your chances for promotion. You may spend the rest of your career at this rank. Callahan leaned back. But you followed protocol. When you gave the order to proceed, you also instructed your personnel to do it correctly. That doesn't excuse your behavior, but it demonstrates that somewhere beneath the assumptions, there's an officer who understands the rules. Thank you, Admiral. Don't thank me. I'm not doing you a favor. Callahan's voice sharpened. I'm giving you a second chance because I believe you can learn from this. Prove me wrong, and that letter of reprimand will be the least of your worries. I understand, ma'am. Do you? Callahan stood, walking to the window. Outside, the sun was beginning to set over Norfolk, painting the base in shades of orange and gold. I've spent 23 years in special operations. You know what the most important lesson I've learned is? Drake shook her head. It's not about strength. It's not about weapons or tactics or training. Callahan turned to face her. It's about never, ever forgetting that every single person you encounter, whether they're wearing a uniform or not, whether they have credentials or not, is a human being first. The moment you start seeing people as categories instead of individuals, you've already lost. Drake sat in silence, absorbing the words. That woman you dismissed today, the homeless vagrant who wasn't worth your time? Callahan's voice softened slightly. She could have been anyone. A veteran who lost everything to PTSD, a mother fleeing an abusive husband, a witness to a crime who needed help. She paused. Or, as it turned out, an admiral conducting a security assessment. The point is, you didn't know, and instead of finding out, you assumed the worst. You're right, Drake said quietly. You're absolutely right. Then remember this feeling. Every time you walk into a checkpoint, every time you see someone who looks like they don't belong, remember how it feels to realize you were the one who didn't understand. Callahan moved toward the door. Dismissed, Lieutenant Commander. And Drake? Yes, ma'am. Do better. The door closed behind Drake, leaving Admiral Callahan alone in Commander Hayes' office. The sun had nearly set now, casting long shadows across the room. She stood at the window, looking out at the base that sprawled beneath her, the ships, the buildings, the thousands of personnel who had no idea what had happened today. Behind her, the door opened. Master Chief Caleb Porter entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need this, Admiral, he said, setting 1 cup on the desk. Callahan turned. You recognized me. It wasn't a question. Porter nodded slowly. Not at first. But when I saw the coin, I served with a SEAL once, back in '07. He had a coin just like that. Same unit markings. He paused. He talked about a woman named Ghost. Said she was the best operator he'd ever worked with. Said if she ever showed up somewhere, looking like she didn't belong, you should run the other way or start praying. A ghost of a smile crossed Callahan's face. Michael Torres. That's him. He's a commander now, running operations out of Coronado. She picked up the coffee, took a sip. How did you know to stay quiet? Figured if you wanted people to know who you were, you would have told them. Porter shrugged. Also figured whatever you were doing was above my pay grade. Sometimes the best thing a sailor can do is follow his gut and keep his mouth shut. That's wisdom a lot of people never learn. Took me 30 years to figure it out. Porter hesitated. Admiral, permission to speak freely? Granted. What happens now? To the base, I mean. To the people who weren't involved but saw what happened. Callahan set down her coffee and moved back to the window. Word is going to spread. It already has. By tomorrow, everyone on this base will know that an admiral was strip-searched at the main gate. She turned to face Porter. And that's exactly what I want. Ma'am? This wasn't just about testing security, Master Chief. This was about sending a message to every guard who thinks they can abuse their authority because no one's watching. To every officer who assumes the worst about people who don't fit their expectations. To everyone who's forgotten that the uniform is supposed to represent something. Porter nodded slowly. And what happens when the next homeless person walks up to the gate? The next civilian with no ID? That's the question, isn't it? Callahan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I can file reports, I can end careers, I can restructure protocols and mandate training, but I can't change culture, not by myself. That takes everyone, every sailor, every officer, every civilian contractor, making the choice to do better. And if they don't, then I'll be back. She picked up her jacket, shrugging it on over her ruined shirt. And next time, I won't announce myself at all. The base was quiet as Admiral Callahan made her way to the parking lot where a black SUV waited. The crowd that had gathered at the checkpoint had dispersed, but she could feel eyes on her from every direction, watching from windows, from doorways, from the shadows between buildings. By tomorrow, she knew, her face would be known. Her reputation would precede her. Good. Master Chief Porter walked beside her, silent and steady. When they reached the SUV, he opened the rear door and stood at attention. "Admiral, it's been an honor." "Master Chief?" Callahan paused before getting in. "That young woman, the recruit who didn't record the incident. What's her name?" "Chen, ma'am. Willow Chen, 3 weeks out of boot camp." "Find her? Tell her I'd like to see her service record." Porter's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't question. "Yes, ma'am." Callahan slid into the back seat. Porter closed the door and moved to the driver's position. She'd requested him specifically, wanting someone she could trust for the ride back. As the SUV pulled away from Norfolk Naval Station, Callahan watched the base shrink in the rearview mirror. The lights were coming on now, fluorescent and harsh, illuminating the buildings and the ships and the checkpoint where everything had happened. Briggs would be court-martialed. Amber would be discharged. Connor would face investigation. Flynn would be reassigned. Drake would carry a letter of reprimand for the rest of her career. And Commander Hayes would spend the next 6 months rebuilding his base's reputation from the ground up. 6 lives changed. 6 lessons learned. But as the satellite phone beside her buzzed with an incoming call, Callahan knew that today's events were just the beginning. She answered on the second ring. "Ghost Actual." The voice on the other end was familiar. Admiral James Warren, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, her boss, the only person who knew the full scope of what she was really doing. "Norfolk is the 3rd facility," Warren said without preamble. "Results? Same as the other 2. Human intelligence protocols compromised. Security procedures more concerned with appearance than substance. Personnel who've forgotten what the uniform actually means. The pattern holds? Unfortunately." Callahan watched the Norfolk skyline disappear behind a row of trees. "But that's not what concerns me." "Explain." "The security vulnerabilities I identified today, the offline camera, the sensor delay, the unsecured ventilation, those aren't random failures. They're systematic. Someone disabled specific systems in a specific pattern." She paused. "Someone who knew exactly what to target." Silence on the other end. Then, "You're saying we have a mole." "I'm saying we have a leak somewhere in Niasvalsi. Someone who has access to security protocols, inspection schedules, and ghost protocol authorization codes." Callahan's voice hardened. "They knew I was coming, Admiral. Maybe not today specifically, but they knew the inspections were happening, and they've been preparing. That's a serious allegation. It's a serious situation." More silence. When Warren spoke again, his voice was grave. "DEVGRU 7 is being activated. We've found a connection point. Communications intercepts that suggest the leak is internal. High-level internal." He paused. "They know about you, Ivory. They know about Ghost." Callahan's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. "Who knows? We haven't identified them yet, but the intercepts are clear. They're tracking your movements, your assessments. They know you're getting close to something." "Then I'll get closer." "That's not why I'm telling you this." Warren's voice carried a warning. "I'm telling you because you need to be careful. Whoever these people are, they're not playing games. 3 facilities compromised in the same way. Coordinated security failures. That's not coincidence. That's infrastructure. They've built something, and you're threatening it." "Good." Callahan looked out the window at the darkening sky. "Then it's time to stop testing and start hunting." She ended the call and set the phone aside. Porter, who had been driving in silence, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Trouble, Admiral?" "Always, Master Chief." She met his eyes in the reflection. "But that's what we're here for." The SUV continued down the highway, carrying Admiral Ivory Callahan away from Norfolk and toward whatever came next. Behind her, the base settled into its evening routine. Guards changing shifts, sailors returning to quarters, officers filing paperwork about an incident that would be talked about for years. And somewhere in the darkness, someone was watching, waiting, planning. The hunt was just beginning. But that's a story for another time. We're about to cross a point of no return. Everything you've seen so far has been building to what comes next. If you're watching without subscribing, now's the time, because in the next few minutes, this whole story explodes. Briggs would need a lawyer, a good one, the kind that specialized in military tribunal defense, JAG proceedings, and court-martial cases. There were online courses now, legal preparedness training for service members facing disciplinary action. He'd laughed at those ads before. He wasn't laughing anymore. Some lessons you learn too late. Now you understand why they call her Ghost. But this story isn't over. There's another video that shows what happened next. The investigation, the classified files, the secrets that never made it to the news. Links in the description. The morning after the incident dawned gray and cold over Norfolk Naval Station, the kind of December morning that made bones ache and breath visible. But the chill in the air was nothing compared to the frost that had settled over the base's administrative offices. Commander Solomon Hayes hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in his office, reviewing security footage, compiling reports, and making phone calls that he'd hoped he would never have to make. The coffee on his desk had gone cold hours ago, but he kept drinking it anyway, the bitter taste matching his mood. At 0600 hours, his phone rang. Fleet Forces Command. "Commander Hayes," the voice on the other end said, "Admiral Richardson wants a full briefing by 0900, in person. Bring everything." The line went dead before Hayes could respond. He set down the phone and looked out his window at the base awakening below. Sailors moving between buildings, their breath fogging in the cold air. Ships sitting at dock, their hulls gleaming with morning frost. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly as it had yesterday morning, before a woman in a torn denim jacket had walked through his gate and destroyed careers with nothing more than patience and a tattoo. But nothing was normal, nothing would be normal for a very long time. The holding area where Briggs had been confined overnight was a small room in the security building, furnished with a cot, a toilet, and a single chair. It wasn't technically a cell, he hadn't been formally charged yet, but the locked door and the guard outside told a different story. Briggs sat on the cot, staring at his hands. They were big hands, capable hands, hands that had held weapons and written reports and grabbed a woman's wrist hard enough to tear her shirt. He kept seeing that moment in his mind, playing on an endless loop. The fabric ripping, the tattoo appearing, the world collapsing. He'd called his wife at midnight after the MPs had escorted him here. She'd cried, asked what was going to happen to them, to their mortgage, to their son's college fund. He hadn't had answers. He still didn't. The door opened and a JAG officer stepped in. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, according to her nameplate. Young, sharp-eyed, with the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen this situation before and wasn't impressed. "Sergeant Briggs," she said, sitting in the chair across from him, "I've been assigned as your preliminary counsel. Before we proceed, I need to inform you of your rights under the Uniform Code of Military Justice." She began reading from a card, the words flowing over Briggs like water over stone. He heard them without processing them. Article 32, investigation, right to counsel, right to remain silent. "Do you understand these rights as I've explained them?" Briggs nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." Mitchell set aside the card and pulled out a tablet. "Now, let's talk about what happened yesterday. Start from the beginning." Briggs opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "Where did you start explaining how you destroyed your own life? How did you put into words the moment when everything you thought you knew turned out to be a lie?" "Sergeant, I thought she was nobody," Briggs finally said, his voice hoarse. "I looked at her and I saw nothing, just another problem to be processed." He laughed bitterly. 12 years in security, 12 years of training, of protocols, of believing I knew how to read people, and I couldn't see what was right in front of me." Mitchell's expression didn't change. "For the record, Sergeant, are you admitting to the actions described in Admiral Callahan's report?" "Yes." The word came out heavy, final. "Yes, I did everything she said I did, and more." She made a note on her tablet. "The charges being considered include conduct unbecoming, abuse of authority, assault, and dereliction of duty. Depending on the investigation's findings, additional charges may be added." "What's the maximum sentence?" Mitchell paused. "For the combined charges, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and confinement for up to 10 years. The number hung in the air. 10 years. His son would be 28 when he got out. His wife would be... He couldn't even think about it. "However," Mitchell continued, Given your service records and the circumstances, a plea arrangement might reduce that significantly. The Admiral hasn't indicated whether she intends to pursue maximum penalties. What do you recommend? I recommend that you cooperate fully with the investigation, express genuine remorse, and hope that Admiral Callahan is as fair in judgment as she is in assessment. Mitchell stood. I'll be back tomorrow with more information. In the meantime, write down everything you remember about yesterday. Every detail, no matter how small. The more complete your account, the better your chances. She left, and the door locked behind her. Briggs sat alone in the silence, thinking about fairness, about judgment, about a woman who had stood in his checkpoint, endured his abuse, and never once raised her voice or lost her composure. Real authority doesn't need a badge. Her words echoed in his mind, and for the first time in his life, Silas Briggs began to understand what they meant. Across the base, in the civilian contractor housing area, Amber Lawson was packing. Her apartment was small, a one-bedroom unit that she'd decorated with photos of her daughter and prints of beaches she'd never visited. The furniture was cheap, bought on credit that she was still paying off. The refrigerator was covered with her daughter's drawings, stick figures, and rainbows, and the word "mommy" written in crayon. She'd been given 24 hours to vacate base housing. Her security clearance had been suspended pending investigation. Her access badge had been confiscated. By this time tomorrow, she would be a civilian again, with no job, no benefits, and no prospects. Her mother had driven down from Richmond overnight to take custody of Emma, her 4-year-old. The handoff had happened at 6 a.m. in the parking lot. Emma still half asleep and confused about why Mommy was crying. "It's going to be okay, baby," Amber had whispered, holding her daughter tight. "Mommy just has to take care of some things. You're going to stay with Grandma for a while." Why? Because Mommy made a mistake. Because Mommy thought she was better than someone else and found out she wasn't. Because Mommy took pictures of a woman being humiliated and thought it was funny. Because Mommy has to work some things out, Amber said instead. "But I'll call you every night, I promise." Now, alone in the apartment, she moved mechanically through the rooms, putting clothes in boxes, dishes in crates, her whole life reduced to cardboard and packing tape. On the counter, her phone buzzed with messages. Friends asking what had happened, family demanding explanations, reporters somehow already sniffing around the story. She ignored them all. The phone she couldn't ignore was the one the investigators had taken. They'd found everything. Every photo she'd taken over the past 3 years. Every detainee she'd mocked. Every vulnerable person she'd turned into entertainment for her social media followers. 217 images, the JAG officer had told her. 217 violations of privacy, of dignity, of basic human decency. Other than honorable discharge was the best-case scenario now. Criminal charges were still on the table. Amber taped up another box and tried not to think about what her daughter would say when she was old enough to understand. Connor Reed had been released to his quarters with orders not to leave the building. Unlike Briggs, he hadn't been formally confined. His involvement was deemed secondary, his culpability less clear. But the investigation was ongoing, and until it concluded, his future remained uncertain. He sat on his bunk, staring at his phone. His father had called 6 times. His mother had called 8. He hadn't answered either. What would he say? "Dad, I kicked a Rear Admiral because I wanted my coworkers to think I was tough. Mom, I watched a woman get strip searched and didn't say a word because I was afraid of being called soft." His roommate, a petty officer named Torres, had been watching him for the past hour with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. "So it's true?" Torres finally asked. "You really assaulted an admiral?" Connor flinched. "I didn't know she was an admiral." "Does that matter?" The question hung in the air. Connor thought about it, really thought about it, for the first time since the incident. "No," he said quietly. "No, I guess it doesn't." Torres nodded slowly. "My grandfather was in the Navy, served 30 years, retired as a chief petty officer. You know what he told me when I enlisted?" Connor shook his head. He said, "The measure of a man isn't how he treats his equals. It's how he treats the people who can't fight back." Torres stood up and walked to the door. "You should think about that." He left, and Connor was alone with the silence and his shame. Lieutenant Commander Fiona Drake sat in her quarters, reading the letter of reprimand for the 5th time. The language was formal, clinical. the kind of bureaucratic prose that reduced human failure to bullet points and regulatory citations, failure to properly supervise, failure to intervene, failure to verify identity before authorizing enhanced security measures. Each failure was a nail in the coffin of her career. She'd worked so hard to get here. Academy graduate, top of her class in officer candidate school, early promotions, excellent evaluations, a trajectory that had seemed unstoppable. And now, because she'd been in a hurry, because she'd assumed, because she'd seen a homeless woman instead of a human being, all of it was in jeopardy. The letter would follow her forever. Every promotion board, every assignment, every opportunity would be filtered through this single afternoon of bad judgment. She might make commander someday, if she was lucky. But captain, admiral, those ranks were closed to her now, as surely as if the doors had been welded shut. Her phone buzzed. A message from her mentor, Captain Rodriguez, who'd guided her career since her first assignment. Heard what happened. Call me when you're ready to talk. Drake stared at the message for a long moment. Then she set the phone aside and picked up the letter again. I'm giving you a second chance because I believe you can learn from this. Admiral Callahan's words echoed in her mind. A second chance. Most people didn't get those. Most people who failed as spectacularly as she had found themselves quietly shuffled into dead-end assignments, their careers allowed to wither until they gave up and resigned. But the Admiral had seen something in her, something worth preserving, something worth another chance. Drake folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. Then she picked up her phone and dialed Captain Rodriguez's number. It was time to figure out how to be better. The news spread through Norfolk Naval Station like fire through dry brush. By noon, everyone knew. An admiral had been strip-searched at the main gate. Careers had been destroyed. An investigation was underway that would likely reach far beyond the 5 people directly involved. In the enlisted mess hall, conversations dropped to whispers whenever officers walked past. In the officers' club, drinks were consumed in unusual quantities. In the security buildings across the base, guards who had never given a second thought to their checkpoint procedures suddenly found themselves reviewing protocols with desperate intensity. Admiral Callahan had wanted to send a message. The message had been received, but not everyone was afraid. In a small office in the administrative building, a man sat at his computer, scrolling through classified communications with an expression of controlled panic. He was middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of person who blended into the background of any military installation. His name was Robert Keene, and he had worked in naval intelligence for 22 years. For the past 3 of those years, he'd also worked for someone else. The woman they called Ghost was getting too close. Her inspections weren't random, they were systematic, methodical, designed to probe specific vulnerabilities that only someone with inside knowledge would know to target. The security gaps she'd identified at Norfolk weren't accidents. They'd been deliberately created, backdoors built into the system, for purposes that had nothing to do with national security. Keene pulled out a burner phone and typed a message. Ghost is hunting, Norfolk compromised. Recommend immediate protocol shift. The response came within minutes. Acknowledged, continue monitoring, package extraction scheduled. He deleted the messages and tucked the phone back into his pocket. Whatever happened next, he needed to stay calm, stay invisible, stay exactly who everyone thought he was. The hunt was on, but the hunter didn't know that the prey was already watching. Now you understand why they call her Ghost. But this story isn't over. There's another video that shows what happened next. The investigation, the classified files, the secrets that never made it to the news. Links in the description. The formal investigation began 3 days after the incident, led by a team from Naval Criminal Investigative Service that descended on Norfolk like a surgical strike force. They interviewed everyone who had been present at the checkpoint. They reviewed every second of security footage. They examined phone records, email logs, personnel files going back years. What they found was worse than anyone had expected. The security vulnerabilities that Admiral Callahan had identified weren't isolated failures. They were part of a pattern that stretched across multiple facilities, multiple years, multiple commands. Someone had been systematically compromising naval security infrastructure, creating gaps that could be exploited by anyone who knew where to look. And someone clearly did. Commander Hayes received the preliminary report on a Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, he'd aged 10 years. How is this possible? He asked the NCIS lead investigator, Special Agent Diana Reeves. A woman whose expression suggested she'd seen things that would give most people nightmares. How could this happen under our noses? That's what we're trying to determine, sir. Reeves spread a series of documents across Hayes' desk. The disabled camera in the inspection room, it was taken offline by someone with administrative access to the security network. The motion sensor delay, introduced through a firmware update that was approved through normal channels. The missing ventilation grating, the maintenance request was filed, approved, and then quietly deleted from the system. You're saying this was deliberate. I'm saying this was sophisticated. Someone with intimate knowledge of your security systems has been making them weaker for at least 18 months. Reeves paused. Admiral Callahan's assessment didn't just expose poor procedures, it exposed sabotage. Hayes sat heavily in his chair. Do we know who? Not yet, but we're working on it. Reeves gathered her documents. In the meantime, Commander, I'd recommend increasing security on all sensitive areas. Whoever did this knew they'd be discovered eventually. They may have other plans in place. Other plans? If I'd spent 18 months building back doors into a naval facility, Reeves said, I'd want to use them before someone closed them. Wouldn't you? She left, and Hayes immediately picked up his phone. He had calls to make. Lots of calls. The court-martial proceedings against Sergeant First Class Silas Briggs began 2 weeks after the incident, faster than anyone had expected. Admiral Callahan had pushed for expedited handling, arguing that the base needed closure and the personnel needed to see that misconduct had consequences. The hearing was held in the base's legal building, a stark room with fluorescent lights and the kind of institutional furniture that seemed designed to crush hope. Briggs sat at the defense table in his dress uniform, medals that he had earned over 12 years of service gleaming on his chest. His attorney, a civilian lawyer his wife had hired by mortgaging their house, sat beside him with a thick folder of documents. Admiral Callahan was present, seated in the gallery in her own dress uniform. She had refused to testify remotely, insisting on being there in person. If I'm going to end a man's career, she'd said, I should at least have the decency to look him in the eye while I do it. The charges were read. The evidence was presented. Security footage showed Briggs throwing the woman's jacket on the floor, invading her personal space, grabbing her wrist. Audio captured his threats, his mockery, his absolute certainty that he was dealing with someone who didn't matter. The defense argued mitigating circumstances. Briggs had been following what he believed to be established practice. He'd never received training on how to handle unidentified civilians who demonstrated unusual knowledge of security systems. He'd been operating under stress, understaffed, concerned about potential threats. None of it mattered. When Briggs was called to make a statement, he stood slowly, his legs unsteady. He looked at the panel of officers who would decide his fate, then turned to face Admiral Callahan. I don't have excuses, he said, his voice rough. I had power, and I abused it. I had authority, and I used it to hurt someone who couldn't fight back. I told myself I was doing my job, protecting the base, following protocol. But that's not what I was doing, he paused, swallowing hard. I was being a bully, plain and simple, and I'm sorry. Not because I got caught, because I finally understand what I did wrong. The room was silent. Admiral Callahan, Briggs continued, what you did took courage. Walking into a hostile situation without backup, without identification, trusting that the system would eventually recognize you. I would never have had that courage. I would never have trusted the system that much. He took a shaky breath. You taught me something about what real strength looks like, about what real authority means. I'm not going to forget it. He sat down. Admiral Callahan's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been respect. The panel deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. The sentence was severe but not maximum, reduction in rank to private, forfeiture of all pay and allowances for 12 months, and a bad conduct discharge to be executed upon completion of confinement. The confinement period was set at 18 months. It could have been worse. It could have been 10 years. But as Briggs was led away by the MPs, his uniform already missing the stripes he'd worn for a decade, worse and less worse seemed like distinctions without difference. His career was over. His life, as he'd known it, was over. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Amber Lawson's discharge processing was completed without ceremony. One moment she was a specialist in the United States Navy. The next, she was a civilian with a DD-214 that might as well have been stamped with the word failure in red letters. The criminal charges had been dropped, ultimately. The photographs she'd taken, while violations of policy, didn't quite rise to the level of criminal prosecution. But the other-than-honorable discharge meant she'd lost everything anyway. Her benefits, her GI Bill eligibility, her ability to ever work in government again. She stood outside the administrative building, holding an envelope with her final paperwork, and watched sailors walk past in uniforms she'd never wear again. Some of them recognized her. Most looked away. Her mother was waiting in the parking lot, Emma in the car seat in back, already asleep. "Ready?" her mother asked. Amber looked back at the beast one last time. 4 years of her life, reduced to a manila envelope and a bus ticket home. "Yeah," she said, "I'm ready." They drove away, and Amber didn't look back again. Connor Reed's investigation concluded with a finding of minor misconduct. He received a formal counseling statement, was reassigned to a non-security position, and was placed on probation for 12 months. His career wasn't over, but it was wounded, limping along under the weight of a mistake he'd made at 21 years old. The night after the findings were announced, he sat in the base chapel, alone in the dim light filtering through stained glass windows. He wasn't particularly religious, hadn't been to church since his grandmother died when he was 16, but something had drawn him here, a need for quiet, a need for space to think. The door opened behind him, and footsteps approached. He didn't turn around. "Mind if I sit?" He looked up. Willow Chen, the female recruit he'd seen watching from the crowd, stood in the aisle with an uncertain expression. "Sure," Connor said. She sat a few pews away, maintaining distance but present. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I saw what happened," Willow finally said. "At the checkpoint, I was there." "Yeah, I saw you too." "Why did you do it? Kick her, I mean." Connor laughed bitterly. "Because I was trying to impress people who weren't worth impressing. Because I wanted to fit in. Because I was scared of being seen as weak." He shook his head. "Pick one. They're all true." Willow was quiet for a moment. My drill instructor told us something during boot camp. He said, "The easy thing and the right thing are almost never the same. Every day you're going to have to choose, and who you become depends on which one you pick." Smart guy. "She, Petty Officer Williams, toughest person I ever met." Willow paused. "I almost recorded what happened, had my phone out and everything, but something stopped me." "What?" "I don't know, it just felt wrong. Like I'd be part of something bad if I did." She looked at him directly. "I think that's what you felt too, deep down, but you ignored it." Connor stared at her. She was young, younger than him, even, but there was something in her eyes that made her seem older, wiser. "You're right," he said quietly. "I knew it was wrong. The whole time I knew, but I did it anyway because it was easier than standing up." Willow nodded slowly. "So, what are you going to do now?" "What do you mean?" "You made a mistake, a bad one, but you're still here. You've still got a chance to be someone different." She stood up. "The question is, are you going to take it?" She walked away, leaving Connor alone with the silence and the fading light. He sat there for a long time, thinking about choices, about who he wanted to be, about who he could still become. When he finally left the chapel, something had shifted inside him. Something small but significant. The first step on a long road. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time since the incident, he wanted to find out. Flynn Garrett received his reassignment orders on a Friday afternoon. Effective immediately, he was being transferred to the Naval Information Warfare Center in San Diego, assigned to a classified project that required his exact combination of skills. The orders had come from high up, higher than his chain of command, higher than Commander Hayes, higher than anyone at Norfolk had the authority to question. Someone had pulled strings on his behalf. He suspected he knew who. On his last day at Norfolk, he found himself at the checkpoint where everything had happened. It looked the same as it had 2 weeks ago. The same gates, the same buildings, the same fluorescent lights. But the guards were different now, more careful, more attentive, more aware that anyone walking through those gates might be more than they appeared. Garrett, he turned. Master Chief Caleb Porter stood behind him, his weathered face as unreadable as ever. "Master Chief?" "Heard you're leaving, San Diego." "Yes, Master Chief. Porter nodded slowly. Good assignment, important work. He paused. You know who made that happen? Flynn hesitated. I have a suspicion. Admiral Callahan doesn't forget the people who show integrity under pressure. She also doesn't forget the people who fail that test. Porter looked at the checkpoint, his eyes distant. I've seen a lot of careers end in that building. Some deserved it, some didn't. The difference usually comes down to one thing. What's that? Whether they learned anything. Porter turned back to Flynn. Did you? Flynn thought about the question carefully before answering. I learned that following orders isn't the same as doing the right thing. I learned that silence can be complicity, and I learned that the people who deserve respect often don't look like what you expect. A hint of something that might have been approval crossed Porter's face. Then you learned more than most people learn in a lifetime. Don't waste it. He walked away, leaving Flynn alone at the checkpoint. The next morning, Flynn boarded a plane for California. His new life waited on the other side of the country, full of challenges and opportunities he couldn't yet imagine. But he carried Norfolk with him. The lessons, the failures, the moment when he'd watched an admiral being humiliated and hadn't done enough to stop it. He'd do better next time. He'd have to. Admiral Ivory Callahan stood at the window of her office at Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters in Coronado, California, watching the Pacific Ocean stretch toward the horizon. 2 weeks had passed since Norfolk. 2 weeks of briefings, reports, investigations, and the quiet work of hunting a shadow that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The phone on her desk buzzed. Admiral, your 3 o'clock is here. Send her in. The door opened and a young woman entered. 19 years old, 3 weeks out of boot camp when the incident had happened. Now 5 weeks in and already catching the attention of people who mattered. Willow Chen stood at attention, her uniform crisp, her eyes uncertain. At ease, Callahan said. Sit down. Willow sat, perching on the edge of the chair as if ready to spring up at any moment. Do you know why you're here? No, ma'am. My orders just said to report to this office. Callahan turned from the window and studied the young woman. There was something there, a quality that couldn't be taught, couldn't be trained, could only be recognized when it appeared. I've been reviewing your file, Seaman Chen. Top scores in basic training, excellent evaluations, strong aptitude test results, particularly in pattern recognition and analytical thinking. She paused. You were present at the Norfolk checkpoint incident. Willow's expression flickered. Yes, ma'am. You had your phone out. You were about to record what was happening, but you stopped. Callahan sat down across from her. Why? Willow hesitated. It didn't feel right, ma'am. Recording something like that, turning someone's humiliation into content. Even if that person turned out to be... She stopped, flushing. An admiral in disguise? Yes, ma'am. Callahan nodded slowly. Most people in your position would have recorded, would have shared it online before the MPs even arrived, would have seen it as entertainment rather than what it was, a violation of human dignity. She leaned forward. Why were you different? Willow thought about the question for a long moment. My grandmother raised me, ma'am, after my parents died. She was a refugee from Vietnam, came over in 1975 with nothing, spent years being treated like she was less than human because of how she looked, how she talked, where she came from. She paused. She taught me that how you treat people when no one important is watching is who you really are, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who turns someone's bad day into a joke. The room was silent. Seaman Chen, Callahan said finally, I'm going to make you an offer. It's unusual, possibly unprecedented, and you're free to decline it without any negative consequences to your career. Willow's eyes widened. Ma'am? I run a special assessment program. Small team, classified work, operating in environments where conventional approaches don't work. We look for people with specific qualities, integrity under pressure, independent judgment, the ability to see what others miss. Callahan paused. I think you have those qualities. I'm just a seaman, ma'am. 3 weeks, 5 weeks, out of basic. You're someone who made the right choice when everyone around her was making the wrong one. That's rarer than you might think. Callahan stood. Think about it. You have 48 hours to decide. If you're interested, report to Building 7 on Monday morning at 0600. If not, return to your regular duties and forget this conversation ever happened. Willow stood slowly, her mind racing. Can I ask one question, ma'am? Go ahead. The program you're talking about. What exactly would I be doing? A ghost of a smile crossed Callahan's face. Learning, watching, developing skills that most people don't know exist. She walked to the door and opened it. And hopefully, becoming the kind of person who makes the Navy better, just by being part of it. Willow walked out in a daze. The door closed behind her, and she stood in the hallway, trying to process what had just happened. 48 hours. A choice that would change everything. She'd already made her decision. The investigation into the Norfolk security breaches continued for 3 months. NCIS agents traced the compromised systems through layers of false trails, dead ends, and deliberately misleading evidence. What they found painted a picture of a conspiracy that reached far beyond a single naval base. 7 facilities had been compromised. 17 individual security systems had been deliberately weakened. Someone had been building infrastructure for something, extraction, infiltration, or worse, and they'd been doing it for years. The breakthrough came in February when a routine financial audit flagged an anomaly in the accounts of a mid-level intelligence officer named Robert Keene. Small payments, carefully hidden, tracing back to shell companies with connections to foreign intelligence services. Keene was arrested on a Tuesday morning, walking to his car in the parking lot of the Norfolk Administrative Building. He didn't resist. He didn't seem surprised. "You're too late," he said as the agents cuffed him. "The package is already gone." He wouldn't say what the package was, wouldn't say who he was working for, wouldn't say anything at all, actually, once his lawyer arrived. But Admiral Callahan had a theory. He wasn't the source, she told Admiral Warren during a secure video conference. He was a relay, passing information up and receiving instructions down. Whoever's really running this operation is still out there. Agreed. We've tracked communications from Keene's burner phone to at least 4 other devices, all of which have since been destroyed. Someone cleaned house the moment he was arrested. They knew we were coming. They always seemed to. Warren's face was grim. DEVGRU 7 has been fully activated. We're treating this as a Tier 1 threat. Whatever they were building at those facilities, it wasn't for small purposes. Callahan thought about the security gaps she'd identified at Norfolk. The camera blind spots, the sensor delays, the unsecured access points. Any one of them could have been used to infiltrate the base, extract personnel, or plant devices that wouldn't be detected until it was too late. "We need to find out what was taken," she said. "What the package was. We're working on it." But Callahan, Warren's voice dropped. "They know about you now. Your cover protocols, your assessment methods, your connection to DEVGRU. Keene had files on you dating back 3 years. I know. You should consider stepping back. Let someone else take point on this." Callahan shook her head slowly. "They have been watching me for 3 years, Admiral. They have had every opportunity to eliminate me, and they haven't. That tells me something." "What?" "That they don't want me dead. They want me distracted, chasing shadows while they complete whatever they're really planning." She leaned forward. "I'm not going to give them that satisfaction." Warren studied her for a long moment. "You always were stubborn." "I prefer persistent." A hint of a smile crossed his face. "Very well. But Callahan, be careful. Whatever this is, it's bigger than Norfolk. Bigger than any of us realized." "I know." She reached for the button to end the call. "That's what makes it worth hunting." The screen went dark, and Admiral Ivory Callahan sat alone in her office, thinking about shadows and hunters and the long game that was only beginning. Somewhere out there, an enemy was watching, planning, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Ghost was watching too, and she was very, very patient. 6 months later, the ceremony was held on the deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the newest and most advanced aircraft carrier in the United States Navy. 300 personnel stood at attention under a clear June sky, watching as Admiral Callahan pinned new insignia on the uniforms of 12 special warfare candidates who had completed training that most people didn't know existed. Among them was a young woman who had, 7 months ago, been nothing but a raw recruit with strong test scores and a grandmother who'd taught her about human dignity. Willow Chen stood at attention as the Admiral approached, her face expressionless but her eyes shining with quiet pride. "Petty Officer Chen," Callahan said, pinning the new rank insignia to her collar, "you've demonstrated exceptional capability, integrity, and judgment during your training period. It is my honor to welcome you to the Naval Special Assessment Program. Thank you, ma'am. Callahan paused, lowering her voice so only Willow could hear. Your grandmother would be proud. Willow's composure cracked, just for a moment. A smile flickered across her face before discipline reasserted itself. I hope so, ma'am. Callahan moved on to the next candidate, but something had passed between them. A recognition, an understanding. The future was uncertain. The enemy was still out there, still planning, still waiting. But the Navy had people like Willow Chen now, people who chose right when everyone else chose easy, people who saw human beings instead of categories, people who might, someday, be ready to carry the torch when the old guard finally stepped aside. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and the deck emptied, Callahan stood at the railing, looking out at the ocean that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Master Chief Porter appeared beside her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one without speaking. Thank you, Master Chief. Ma'am. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the waves and the seagulls and the vast blue expanse that had been the Navy's domain for centuries. Do you think it matters? Porter finally asked. What we did at Norfolk, the careers we ended, the lessons we taught. Do you think any of it actually changes anything? Callahan considered the question carefully. I used to believe that one person couldn't change a system. That culture was too big, too entrenched, too resistant to individual action. She took a sip of coffee. I was wrong. Ma'am? One person can't change everything, but one person can change one thing. And if enough people change enough things, she shrugged. Eventually, the whole picture shifts. Porter nodded slowly. The young ones, Chen and her class, they're different than we were at their age. Better? More aware, maybe. More conscious of the weight of the uniform. He paused. They've seen what happens when people forget that weight. They won't make the same mistakes. No, Callahan agreed. They'll make new ones, different ones. That's how progress works. You solve the old problems and discover new ones waiting underneath. Sounds exhausting. A rare smile crossed Callahan's face. It is, but it's also the only thing worth doing. Her satellite phone buzzed. She checked the screen, and her expression shifted subtly. Not alarm, not surprise, but recognition. The hunt was still on. The shadows were still moving. Duty calls, Master Chief. Always does, Admiral. She walked away across the deck, her footsteps firm and purposeful, already focused on whatever came next. Master Chief Porter watched her go, then turned back to the ocean. Somewhere out there, storms were brewing. Enemies were planning. The world was full of people who wanted to tear down everything the uniform represented. But it was also full of people like Admiral Callahan, like Willow Chen, like the thousands of sailors and officers who put on the uniform every day and tried, however imperfectly, to live up to what it meant. That had to count for something. Porter finished his coffee and headed below deck. There was work to do, always work to do, and he had long since learned that the only way through was forward. The hunt continued, the story continued, and somewhere in the darkness, Ghost was still watching. The phone call that would change everything came at 03:17 on a Thursday morning. Admiral Callahan was asleep in her quarters on the Coronado base when the secure line rang. She was awake and answering within 3 seconds, a habit from decades of midnight alerts, emergency deployments, and conversations that couldn't wait for daylight. Ghost, actual. Admiral. The voice belonged to Admiral Warren, and something in his tone made Callahan sit up straighter. We found the package. Where? That's the problem. Warren paused. It's not a thing. It's a person. One of ours. Someone extracted from Norfolk 3 days before your assessment. Callahan's blood went cold. Who? Lieutenant Commander David Park, intelligence officer. He was reported UA, unauthorized absence, and everyone assumed he'd gone AWOL over personal issues. Turns out he was taken. Keen's network grabbed him and shipped him overseas before anyone realized what was happening. Is he alive? Unknown. But we've intercepted communications suggesting he's being held somewhere in Eastern Europe. They want something from him, something he knows that we didn't realize he knew. Callahan was already out of bed, pulling on clothes. What did he have access to? That's what we're trying to determine. But, Admiral, Warren's voice dropped. His specialty was penetration analysis, identifying weaknesses in enemy systems, finding ways in that no one else could see. You're saying he knew how to break into things. I'm saying he might know how to break into everything, including our things. If the wrong people get that knowledge out of him, I understand. Callahan was dressed now, moving toward her office. What do you need from me? DEVGRU 7 is being briefed as we speak. You're the mission commander. Wheels up in 4 hours. She stopped walking. Admiral, with respect, I'm a flag officer. I don't go on field operations anymore. You do now. This comes from the Secretary himself. Park knows you. You served together in '09. If anyone can get him out in one piece, psychologically stable enough to be useful, it's you. Callahan closed her eyes. 23 years of service. Countless operations, countless missions, countless moments when everything hinged on decisions made in fractions of seconds. She'd thought those days were behind her. Apparently not. 4 hours, she said. I'll be ready. She ended the call and stood in the darkness of her quarters, thinking about Lieutenant Commander David Park, about the knowledge locked in his head, about the enemies who wanted to extract it. The hunt had just become a rescue mission, and Ghost was going back into the field. As she gathered her equipment and prepared for the operation ahead, Admiral Callahan allowed herself one moment of reflection. The past 7 months had been building to this. The inspections, the investigations, the slow unraveling of a conspiracy that reached deeper than anyone had imagined. Norfolk had been the beginning, the visible tip of an iceberg that descended into darkness. Now she was going to find out how deep it went. Her last act before leaving was to send a message to Willow Chen, newly promoted and newly assigned to a position that would keep her informed of developments. Watch everything, trust no one, and remember, real authority doesn't need a badge. 3 hours and 47 minutes later, Admiral Ivory Callahan boarded a military transport aircraft bound for a location that didn't officially exist, to rescue a man who wasn't officially missing from enemies who weren't officially identified. The hunt was evolving, the story was far from over, and Ghost was just getting started.